About Red Square, Russia. Red Square is a square located next to the Kremlin, Moscow, Russia. Around this square, there is the Museum of the History of the Soviet Union, St. Basil's Cathedral, which was built in the 14th century along with the fall of Kazan, and Lenin's mausoleum as the resting place of Vladimir Lenin's preserved body. Red Square was once used for the coronation of Russian kings and tsars, which is now the center of community activities such as ceremonies, state speeches, presidential inaugurations, national holiday celebrations, music concerts, and military parades, which were initiated by the Soviet Union and continued by the Russian Federation. In addition, Red Square has been a UNESCO World Heritage Site since 1990. History of Red Square. Red Square before the 18th century. The eastern side of the Kremlin Triangle, located adjacent to Red Square and between the Moskva and Neglinnaya rivers, was considered the most vulnerable side of the Kremlin to attack, since it was not protected by rivers or other natural features. Therefore, the Kremlin walls were built to their highest height on this side, and the Italian architects involved in the construction of the fortress convinced Ivan III to clear the area outside the walls to create a shooting range. Red Square was then a prominent landing place and trade center for Moscow. Although Ivan the Great decreed that trade should only be conducted from person to person, over time, this rule was relaxed, and permanent market buildings began to appear on the square. After a fire in 1547, Ivan IV reorganized the wooden shops that lined its eastern side into market rows. After a few years, the Cathedral of the Intercession of the Virgin, commonly known as St. Basil's Cathedral, was built over the moat under the reign of Ivan IV. This was the first building that gave the square its characteristic silhouette. Today, pyramidal roofs had not yet been built on the Kremlin towers. In 1595, the wooden market lane was replaced with a stone one. At that time, a brick platform for the proclamation of Tsarist decrees, known as Lobnye Mesto, was also built. Red Square was considered a holy place. Various festive processions were held there, and during Palm Sunday, the famous donkey procession was held, during which the patriarch, sitting on a donkey, accompanied by the Tsar and the people, came out of St. Basil's Cathedral in the Kremlin. During the expulsion of the Polish army from Moscow in 1612, Prince Dmitry Pozharsky entered the Kremlin through the square. In memory of this event, he built the Kazan Cathedral in honor of the Kazan icon of the Mother of God, which had accompanied his army on a campaign. At the same time, 1624 to 1625, the Spasskaya Tower received its contemporary roof. This was done at the suggestion of the Scottish architect Christopher Galloway, who was called to design a new tower clock and suggested arranging the roof over the clock. In the middle of the century, a gilded two-headed eagle was installed on the tower. After this, the square became known as Krasivaya Beautiful. Red Square in the 18th century. During her reign, Catherine the Great decided to make improvements to the square. In 1786, the upper floor of the market lane was made of stone. It was built across the square, near the moat between the Spasskaya and Nikolskaya towers. Then the architect Matvey Kazakov built in the old form a new Lobnye Mesto from hewn stone, a little to the west of the previous place. Red Square in the 19th and early 20th centuries. In 1804, Red Square was paved with stone. In 1806, the Nikolskaya Tower was rebuilt in the Gothic style. A new phase of the improvement of the square began after the Napoleonic invasion and the fire of 1812. The moat was filled in 1813, and in its place, rows of trees were planted. The market lane along the moat was demolished, and on the east side, Joseph Bubb built a new lane building in the Empire style. In 1818, the monument to Minin and Pozharsky was erected. Its construction symbolized the rise of patriotic consciousness during the war. In 1874, the historical building of the Zemsky Prikaz was demolished. In its place, the Imperial Historical Museum was built in pseudo-Russian architecture. After the demolition of the above line, new large buildings were erected between 1888 and 1893, also in the pseudo-Russian style, the Upper Line Gum Department Store and the Middle Line. The Upper Line was intended for merchants to sell their goods, and was the first department store in Moscow. The Middle Line was intended for wholesale trade. At the same time, in 1892, the square was lit by electric lanterns. In 1909, a tram appeared on the square for the first time. Red Square in the Soviet era. During the Soviet era, Red Square became a focal point for the country. In addition to being the venue for official speeches by the Soviet government, it was famous as the location for military parades from 1919 onwards. Lenin's mausoleum was built in 1924, which also served as a tribune for important officials at major events. In the 1930s, the Kazan Cathedral and the Iverskaya Chapel with the Resurrection Gate were demolished to make room for heavy military vehicles passing through the square. Both were later rebuilt after the fall of the Soviet Union. There were plans to demolish Moscow's most famous building, St. Basil's Cathedral, to widen Red Square, as well as the State Historical Museum. Legend has it that Lazar Kaganovich, an associate of Stalin and director of planning for the reconstruction of Moscow, prepared a special model of Red Square, into which the cathedral could be moved, and brought it to Stalin to demonstrate how it would be an obstacle to parades and traffic. Two of the most famous military parades in Red Square were the October Revolution Parade of 1941, when the city was under siege by the German army, and the Victory Parade of 1945, when the banners of the defeated Nazi army were raised and then dropped in front of Lenin's mausoleum. The Soviet Union held numerous parades in Red Square for May Day until 1969, Victory Day, and October Revolution Day, featuring propaganda, flags, workers' demonstrations, marching troops, and displays of tanks and missiles. It also hosted the state funeral of Joseph Stalin on March 9, 1953. Soviet military parades were held on Victory Day in 1945, 1965, 1985, and 1990. Since 1995, the annual Moscow Victory Day Parade has been held in the square, marking the anniversary of the defeat of Nazi Germany in World War II. In 1990, the Kremlin and Red Square became one of the first sites in the Soviet Union to be inscribed on the UNESCO World Heritage List. Red Square in the modern Russian era. Red Square has also served as a famous concert venue. Linkin Park, The Prodigy, TATU Shakira, Scorpions, Paul McCartney, Roger Waters, Red Hot Chili Peppers, and many other celebrities have performed. For New Year's Eve celebrations in 2006, 2007, and 2008, a skating rink was set up on Red Square. Paul McCartney's appearance there was a historic moment for Russians, as the Beatles were banned during the Soviet era. The Soviet Union also banned the sale of Beatles records. While McCartney's appearance was historic, he was not the first Beatle to perform in Russia. Former Beatle Ringo Starr and his all-star band performed at Moscow's Russia Hall in August 1998. On December 4, 2008, the KHL announced that they would hold their first all-star game on January 10 at Red Square. In January 2008, Russia announced that it would resume military vehicle parades on Red Square. In May 2008, Russia held its annual Victory Day Parade, where for the first time since the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, Russian military vehicles paraded through the square. On May 9, 2010, to commemorate the 65th anniversary of Germany's surrender in 1945, the armed forces of France, the United Kingdom, and the United States marched in Moscow's Victory Day Parade for the first time in history. Don't forget to also visit the source website of the article that I have listed in the description column. Thank you for taking the time to watch this video. Hopefully it is useful.